they say. The snow up in Ash Hollow don't just bury the road, it buries a man's heart if he ain't careful. Folks out here survive on grit, whiskey, and keeping their mouths shut. But the day Marty Hughes rolled into town with a coat 2 sizes too small and a voice too big to fit in any box, something shifted. She wasn't pretty by their standards, wasn't polite by their rules. But Lord, when she sang, it was like someone lit a fire in the bones of a frozen town. She didn't ask to be a miracle. She just wanted work. But some places don't take kindly to difference, and some men ain't ready to feel again. Not until they hear it. Not until her song cuts through the noise, the gossip, the pain, and reminds them what it means to belong. Would you have stayed quiet like the rest? Or stood with the woman who made the snow melt just by standing still? What would you have done that night she sang? Leave your thoughts down below. This story ain't done till we hear your part of it. The wind, sharp as a shard of freshly broken ice, had been Marty Hughes's unwelcome companion for the better part of 3 days as she'd made her way up into the Colorado Rockies. Now, as the last dregs of a bitter November afternoon bled into an early dusk, it howled a mournful welcome to Ash Hollow. The town, if one could call a scatter of rough-hewn cabins and a single, defiantly lit saloon a town, huddled in a narrow valley, already buried shoulder-deep in the season's first heavy snows. It looked like the kind of place the world forgot existed. Come winter, and that, Marty figured, was just fine by her. Marty wasn't built like the fragile songbirds some men crooned about in their fireside ballads. She was a woman carved from sturdier timber, broad in the shoulder, with hands that knew hard work, and a frame that had borne more than its share of unkind glances and whispered remarks. Built like a draft horse. That one she'd heard more times than she cared to count. But within that solid frame resided a voice, a surprising, soaring gift that could fill a cathedral or hush a rowdy tavern. A voice that was her only currency in a world that often judged by surfaces. The sign above the saloon, the pick and shovel, creaked a rusty lament against the wind. Pushing open the heavy door, Marty was met with a wall of heat, stale beer, sweat, and the low grumble of men's voices. This, she knew, would be the town's beating heart, its only refuge from the encroaching cold and the deeper chill of isolation until the spring thaw decided to remember Ash Hollow. Her eyes, adjusting to the gloom, scanned the room. Miners, mostly, faces weathered by wind and ambition, hands calloused from pickaxes and pans. At a table near the back, half shrouded in shadow, sat a man who seemed to carry the mountain stillness within him. Silas Blackwood. She didn't know his name then, only registered the profound solitude that clung to him like the scent of pine and damp earth. He nursed a whiskey, his gaze distant, lost in a landscape only he could see. Later, she'd learn about the mine collapse, the wife and 2 small sons swallowed by the unforgiving rock, a tragedy that had driven him deep into himself, leaving him a man of few words and even fewer smiles. A portly man with a stained apron and an air of beleaguered authority wiped down the bar. Looking for someone. "Ma'am?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. "Work," Marty stated, her voice even, betraying none of the weariness that pulled at her bones. "Name's Marty Hughes. Can cook, clean, serve 'em, not afraid of hard labor." The proprietor, a fellow named Jebediah Stone, eyed her up and down. His gaze lingered on her solid build, and Marty saw the familiar flicker of dismissal. Kitchen help? Maybe. Washing dishes. Got a girl who usually does. But she's down with the lung fever. He didn't ask if she could do anything more. In his eyes, and likely the eyes of every man in that room who'd bothered to notice her, she was already categorized. Sturdy, plain, fit for scrubbing, not for much else. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of scalding water, clattering plates, and the dull ache in her back. Marty kept her head down. Her words few. She saw the way the men looked past her, their eyes sliding off her as if she were part of the worn floorboards. She heard the occasional muttered comment, the snickers quickly stifled. It was an old, familiar song, one she'd learned to endure, though the melody never quite lost its sting. Silas Blackwood was a regular fixture, always at that same shadowed table. He'd nod, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, when she brought him his coffee or cleared his plate. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, would meet hers for a fleeting second, holding a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. He never spoke beyond a gruff, "Much obliged," but in those brief encounters, Marty sensed a shared understanding of solitude, a quiet kinship of spirits accustomed to the fringes. As November deepened into December, the snows piled higher, sealing Ash Hollow off from the outside world as surely as if a stone door had been rolled across the valley entrance. With the isolation came the inevitable cabin fever. The pick and shovel, once a place of boisterous camaraderie, began to simmer with a restless, irritable energy. Tempers frayed, arguments flared over card games and imagined slights. The laughter grew louder, coarser, tinged with a desperate edge. One evening, the tension was thicker than the pipe smoke that hazed the air. A fight had nearly broken out over a disputed hand of poker, and Jedediah was looking more harried than usual. The usual entertainment, a wheezy accordion played by a one-eyed prospector named Finn, only seemed to grate on already raw nerves. "Wish we had a decent piano," Jed muttered, more to himself than anyone, as he slammed a bottle of whiskey onto the bar, "or someone who could carry a tune without soundin' like a dyin' coyote." A young miner, emboldened by drink, gestured towards Marty, who was wiping down a table nearby. "Hey, Jeb, what about her? She's big enough. Maybe she's got a big voice, too." A wave of rough laughter followed. Marty froze, her cheeks flushing. She could feel their eyes on her now, not dismissive, but mocking, challenging. Jedediah looked from the miner to Marty, a speculative gleam in his eye. He was desperate, anything to break the monotony, to quell the rising tide of discontent. "Well, Marty," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden hush, "can you sing, girl? Or is washing dishes your only talent?" The air crackled. Marty straightened, her chin lifting. The old shame warred with a flicker of defiance. She thought of all the times she'd been judged, dismissed. She thought of the music that lived inside her, a secret garden no one had ever bothered to look for. "I can sing some," she said, her voice low, but steady, a few snorts, a disbelieving chuckle. Silas Blackwood, Marty noticed, had lifted his head. His gaze wasn't mocking. It was watchful. "All right then," Jedediah declared, a hint of a challenge in his tone. "Floor's yours. Can't be worse than Finn's caterwauling." He gestured to the small, clear space near the cold hearth. Marty moved slowly, deliberately, to the center of the room. The miners watched, a mixture of amusement and skepticism on their faces. She could feel the weight of their expectations, or lack thereof. She took a breath, a deep, centering one, and closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the smirking faces. The dim, smoky room, she reached inside, to that quiet place where her music lived. And then, she sang. It wasn't a bawdy saloon ditty or a mournful trail ballad. Not at first. She started with something softer, an old hymn her mother used to hum, a melody as clear and pure as a mountain spring. Her voice, a rich, unexpectedly nimble alto that could climb to soprano heights with an astonishing sweetness, filled the room. It wasn't just loud, it was full. It wrapped around them, seeped into the wood, quieted the restless shuffling and the nervous coughs. The change in the saloon was palpable. Men who had been slouching in their chairs sat up straighter. Mugs were lowered. Conversations died mid-sentence. Jaws literally dropped. They had expected, well, They hadn't expected this. This voice, coming from this woman, was a revelation, a paradox that their simple categorizations couldn't contain. She moved from the hymn to a ballad of lost love, her voice swelling with a sorrow that was both personal and universal. Then, a livelier tune, one that spoke of open prairies and endless skies, her notes dancing with a lightness that belied her sturdy frame. The range was astounding, from the dusky resonance of a cello to the clear, high notes of a flute. The silence in the pick and shovel was profound. It wasn't an empty silence, but one filled with an almost reverent awe. Even the wind outside seemed to have quieted its howling. As if straining to listen, Marty sang with her eyes closed, lost in the music, unaware of the spell she was weaving. When the last note faded, an echo of pure sound lingering in the rafters. The silence held for a beat, two, then broke. It wasn't the raucous applause of a drunken crowd. It was something deeper, more heartfelt, a slow, spreading wave of clapping, punctuated by murmurs of well, I'll be... And did you hear that? Marty opened her eyes, a little dazed, a flush rising on her cheeks. She saw faces transformed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a mixture of wonder and a grudging respect. Jedediah Stone was staring at her, his mouth agape, the earlier sarcasm completely wiped from his face. Her gaze drifted, inevitably, to the back table. Silas Blackwood hadn't clapped. He sat perfectly still, his whiskey untouched, his usually guarded eyes fixed on her. And in their stormy depths, Marty saw something she hadn't seen there before, something that wasn't just sorrow or solitude. It was a flicker of light, distant but definite, like the first star appearing in a twilight sky. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. It was more than approval. It felt like recognition. In the heart of a frozen, forgotten town, a woman they hadn't waited for, a woman they had utterly underestimated, had finally found her voice. And in the quiet attention of a man lost in his own winter, she sensed that perhaps, just perhaps, she was finally being heard. That single, heartfelt nod from Silas Blackwood was a beginning. Though Marty Hughes couldn't have put a name to what it started, it was like the first crack of ice on a frozen river, a subtle shift hinting at the current moving deep beneath. From that night on, Marty sang, not for payment. Not at first, though Jedediah Stone, his face still slack with wonder, pressed a few coins into her hand with a mumbled, that was something. Marty, something else? She sang because the men, their faces stark in the lantern glow, asked her to, their requests gruff but earnest. So, Marty Hughes, the woman they'd sized up for her sturdiness and consigned to the dish tubs, became Ash Hollow's unlikely songbird. Each evening, after the last plate was dried and stacked, she would step into the center of the pick and shovel, and the rough-edged anxieties of the isolated mining camp would soften, just a little. Her voice became the town's metronome, setting a rhythm against the relentless beat of the winter wind and the gnawing fear of the deep snows. She sang of home, of distant loves, of prairies wide and mountains grand, and for a little while, the men forgot their aching backs and the meager returns from their frozen claims. They were, for the duration of a song or two, transported. Yet, admiration for the voice didn't wholly erase the judgment of the vessel. While her melodies earned her nods and quiet thanks, her presence, her very form, still drew unwelcome scrutiny. There were still the lingering stares, assessing her width rather than her worth. Whispers followed her, not always kind. Shame such a voice is trapped in a body like that, one miner muttered, loud enough for her to hear, as she passed with a tray of empty mugs. Another, bolder and drunker, reached out to pinch her arm as she served him, his eyes leering. Got some good padding on ya. Songbird, keep a man warm. I bet. Marty had pulled away sharply, her glare enough to make him shrink back. But the insult, the casual violation, stung like the bitter cold. One man's attention was more polished, yet somehow more unsettling. Hollis Craig, the manager of the Consolidated Star Mine, the biggest operation in Ash Hollow, began to frequent the saloon more often. He was a man who wore his authority like a well-tailored coat, a stark contrast to the rough-spun miners. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with eyes that missed little and a smile that didn't quite reach them. He'd watch Marty sing, not with the open appreciation of the others, but with a calculating intensity. "Miss Hughes," he said one evening, approaching her as she caught her breath after a particularly stirring ballad. His voice was smooth, cultured. "Your talent is remarkable. Wasted in a place like this. If you don't mind my saying, it's work." "Mr. Craig," Marty replied evenly, not appreciating the implication. "And this place needs its songs." Indeed, he leaned closer, his scent of bay rum and faint cigar smoke invasive. "A woman of your unique attributes and talents could find more comfortable arrangements. A man in my position could be a valuable friend." His gaze dropped meaningfully to her bodice, then back to her eyes. Marty felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was the same old story, just dressed in finer clothes. "I'm not looking for arrangements, Mr. Craig," she said, her voice firm but polite. "I'm content with my work here." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before the smooth mask returned. "A pity," he murmured. "Perhaps you'll reconsider." She didn't. And soon, little things started to go wrong. The delivery of firewood for the kitchen stove would be inexplicably delayed. Her small supply of mending thread, kept in a tin by the hearth, vanished. Jed complained that Craig was suddenly finding fault with the saloon's liquor orders, hinting at revoking credit, subtle pressures, like a vice tightening slowly. Marty knew, with a weary certainty, that Craig was behind it. But amidst these small, biting harassments, other, quieter things began to happen. One morning, stepping out from the lean-to behind the saloon where she slept, she found a thick, knitted woolen scarf lying on the snow-dusted stoop. It was gray, like a winter sky, soft and clearly handmade. There was no note, no indication of who might have left it. Another day, after a particularly heavy snowfall had blocked her narrow path to the outhouse, she awoke to find it neatly cleared, the snow banked high on either side, and sometimes, when the wind howled with particular fury and the lean-to's walls seemed to breathe the cold, she'd find an extra stack of freshly split kindling beside her door, more than Jed usually provided for her small stove. She never saw who did these things, but her gaze would often find Silas Blackwood, watching her from his shadowed corner during her songs, his face unreadable. He never stayed long after she finished, just a slow draining of his glass, a quiet nod in her general direction if their eyes met, and then he'd be gone, melting into the snowy darkness like a phantom. Yet, she began to suspect these acts of quiet consideration, unsigned and unheralded, felt like his brand of communication, as spare and as profound as his rare words. One afternoon, Jed found her staring at the gray scarf, now wrapped snugly around her neck, her fingers tracing its intricate knit. The wind was particularly vicious, rattling the saloon's windows. "Good, that," he grunted, nodding at the scarf, "keeps the chill out." Marty managed a small smile. "It does." She hesitated. Then, compelled by a need to voice the pressures that were building, she said, "Mr. Craig is making things difficult." Jed sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. Figured as much. Man's got an ego as big as the Rockies and twice as craggy when he's crossed. Don't let him get to you. Marty, your singing's the only thing keepin' this town from tearing itself apart right now. The simple statement of support warmed her. "It's not the first time a man's tried to tell me my place," she said, her voice softer now, a shadow of old hurts in her eyes. She looked out at the swirling snow, the world reduced to shades of white and gray. When I was a girl, I was sent to a place, Ediush, Correctional Institute for Young Women. They said I was too big, unladylike. Her voice was barely a whisper. They tried to starve the size off me, said a woman should be delicate. A bitter smile touched her lips, and my voice. At the church back home, the choir master, he loved it. But the pastor's wife, she said it was too strong for a woman. Too passionate, distracting. Eventually, they asked me not to sing in the choir anymore. Jed listened, his usual gruffness softened by a rare display of empathy. He shook his head slowly. Some folks wouldn't know sunshine if it landed in their stew. Marty, her story, an admission of vulnerabilities she rarely showed, hung in the air between them. The quiet acts of kindness, the memory of past cruelties, Craig's unwelcome advances. It all swirled inside her like the snow outside. A few days later, a trapper, half frozen and wild-eyed, stumbled into Ash Hollow, having barely outrun a blizzard. He brought news that chilled the marrow far more than the falling temperatures. A gang of outlaws, led by a ruthless cutthroat named Blackheart Donovan, had been wintering in a hidden valley further west. Word was, their supplies were running low, and the law was closing in from the south. Their only escape route, if they were desperate enough to try it through the high passes in this weather, would lead them straight towards the isolated, snowbound cluster of souls in Ash Hollow. The news spread through the pick and shovel like wildfire. Suddenly, the cabin fever, the petty squabbles, even Hollis Craig's machinations, seemed to shrink in significance. A new, more tangible fear settled over the town. Cold and sharp, every gust of wind against the eaves now sounded like a potential threat. Every shadow outside the window, a harbinger of unwelcome visitors. And Marty knew, as she watched the men's faces harden, that her songs, which had offered solace, might soon be needed to summon courage. The trapper's news laid a fresh shroud over Ash Hollow, colder and more menacing than the deepest snowdrift. The fear of Blackheart Donovan's gang was a palpable thing, a bitter taste in the back of every throat. But the mountains, as they often did, held other, more immediate sorrows in their stony grasp. It happened just as dawn was painting the eastern peaks with a pale, grudging light, a rumble, distant at first. Then a shudder that ran through the frozen earth itself. Men stumbled from their cabins, their faces grim. The Consolidated Star. Something was wrong. Hollis Craig, his usual arrogance replaced by a chalky pallor, was already shouting orders, his voice thin against the vast silence of the snow. A cave-in. Section 4. 6 men had been on the early shift. 6 men now lay somewhere under tons of rock and frozen earth. Among them was young Tom Harris, barely 18, the only son of Martha Harris, a widow who did mending for the town. A knot of miners, their faces etched with dread, gathered near the mine entrance. Jedediah Stone was there, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a somber quiet. And then, a figure emerged from the edge of the gathered crowd, moving with a purpose that stilled the anxious chatter. Silas Blackwood. He carried a coil of rope over one shoulder and a miner's lamp in his hand. His face was a mask, carved from the same granite as the mountains, but his eyes, those winter sky eyes, held a terrible, familiar light. This was the maw that had swallowed his world, the place he hadn't been able to bring himself to enter for 5 long years. "I know that section," Silas said, his voice raspy, unused to carrying in such a gathering. "I'll lead a crew." No one questioned him. His past tragedy, the very thing that had isolated him, now gave him an undeniable authority. Men who had only known him as a silent, grieving shadow now looked to him. He picked his team with curt nods, experienced hands who knew the risks. Hollis Craig started to protest, to assert his own authority, but a look from Silas, a look that held the weight of unspeakable loss and unyielding resolve, silenced him as the rescue party disappeared into the black throat of the mine. A hush fell over those left behind. Martha Harris stood a little apart, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her gaze fixed on the dark opening that held her son. Marty watched her, her heart aching with a helplessness that was almost unbearable. What could songs do against such a terrible, silent weight of rock? But then she saw the faces around her. The fear, the despair, the desperate clinging to the smallest sliver of hope. She saw Martha Harris sway, and Jed reach out a rough hand to steady her, and Marty knew she couldn't just stand there. She went back to the pick and shovel, not for her shawl, but for the largest pot she could find, filling it with coffee, gathering what bread and cold meat was available. Returning to the mine head, she set up a small fire, coaxing it to life against the biting wind. The aroma of coffee, weak but hot, cut through the icy air. And then, softly, hesitantly at first, she began to sing, not the lively tunes of the saloon, but the old hymns, the ones that spoke of solace and endurance. Her voice, rich and mournful, rose into the gray morning, a thread of warmth against the vast, indifferent cold. She sang for Martha Harris, for the wives and kin of the other men, for the grim-faced miners waiting for news. She sang for Silas, facing his ghosts in the darkness below. She sang, perhaps, to keep her own heart from breaking. Hours crawled by, each one an eternity. The coffee dwindled. The fire smoked. Marty's voice, though she paused for rest, never truly faltered. It became an anchor, a fragile beacon in the encroaching despair. Late in the afternoon, a flicker of light from the mine entrance. The rescue party emerged, one by one, their faces grim, their bodies slumped with exhaustion. Silas was last, his shoulders bowed, his face smudged with dirt and a deeper, older grief. He carried something in his arms, wrapped in a blanket. Young Tom Harris. He hadn't made it. 2 others. They'd found alive, injured, but breathing. 3 more were gone. A low, collective moan went through the waiting crowd. Martha Harris let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more a tearing of the soul, and collapsed into Jed's supporting arms. The rescued men were helped towards the warmth of the cabins. In the midst of the raw, open grief, the shuffling feet, the hushed, heartbroken whispers, Marty continued to sing. Her voice was thick with unshed tears, but it held steady. It was a lament now, a song of sorrow, yet beneath it, a current of unwavering strength. It didn't lessen the pain, she knew that, but it held them together, a community bound by loss, sharing the unutterable. Her voice seemed to say, "We are still here. We endure." Silas, after gently laying his burden down and speaking in low tones to Jed, looked towards Marty. His eyes met hers across the snow, across the sorrow, and in their depths, she saw not just pain, but a profound, weary gratitude. He understood what she was doing, what her voice meant in that moment of shared desolation. The weight of the tragedy settled heavily on Ash Hollow that night. The threat of Donovan's gang, which had briefly receded, now felt even more ominous. They were vulnerable, their spirits battered. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. Under the cover of a moonless, starless night, shouts, the crack of a rifle, the splintering of a door. Marty, jolted from a fitful sleep in her lean-to, felt a cold dread seize her. She heard coarse laughter, a man's cry of pain, peeking through a crack in the rough plank wall. She saw them, dark figures, hard-faced and heavily armed, dragging men from their cabins. The pick and shovel's main door was kicked in, and then she saw Silas, a lantern held high by one of the outlaws, illuminating his defiant face. He was struggling, but 2 men held him fast. A hulking figure with a tangle of black beard and cruel eyes. Blackheart Donovan himself, strode into the center of the small, terrified group of townsfolk herded outside the saloon. "Evenin', folks," he sneered, his voice like gravel. "Heard you got a songbird in this town, and I hear my associate, Mr. Blackwood here," he gave Silas a vicious shake, "is a particular fan. We're tired, we're cold, and we need some entertainment before we take what we need. So, Songbird, how's about a final performance for your friend?" His eyes, glinting in the lantern light, found Marty as she was pulled roughly from her lean-to by another outlaw. Fear, stark and cold, threatened to paralyze her. Silas. They had Silas. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not fear for himself, but a desperate warning for her. "Sing," Donovan roared, shoving a pistol against Silas's temple. "Or he gets it now." Marty's mind raced. She needed time. They needed time. She took a shaky breath. What would you like to hear?" She managed, her voice trembling only slightly. "Something sweet." Donovan grinned, a wolfish, predatory expression. "To remember you by..." She began to sing, her voice starting low, a mournful folk tune. As the melody filled the terrifying silence, she saw Silas's eyes, focused, intense. He was watching Donovan, watching the man's grip on the pistol. Her voice gained strength, soaring into the cold night air, each note chosen to hold their attention. To stretch the seconds, she saw the outlaws, mesmerized for a moment by the sheer, unexpected beauty of the sound. Then, with a sudden, explosive movement, Silas drove his head back into the face of the man, holding him from behind, simultaneously twisting and bringing his boot down hard on Donovan's instep. Donovan howled in pain, his pistol wavering for a fraction of a second. It was all the chance they'd get. In that instant, Marty, acting on pure instinct, grabbed the heavy, cast-iron skillet she'd left by her door earlier. With a strength born of desperation, she swung it with all her might, not at Donovan, but at the outlaw closest to her, the one who had pulled her out. The skillet connected with his temple with a sickening thud, and he crumpled without a sound. Chaos erupted. Donovan, enraged, fired his pistol wildly. Silas, free for a moment, tackled another outlaw. From somewhere, Jedediah, who'd been feigning collapse, produced an old shotgun. The night exploded with shouts, gunshots, and the sounds of struggle. Marty saw an outlaw aiming at Silas's exposed back. Without thinking, she snatched up the pistol dropped by the man she'd felled. She'd never fired a gun in her life. Her hand shook, but her gaze was steady. She aimed, squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed her arm, the shot deafeningly loud. The outlaw screamed, clutching his shoulder, his own shot going wide. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive, faced with sudden, fierce resistance, and with their leader howling and another of their number down. The remaining outlaws broke and fled into the darkness, their bravado vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, broken only by Donovan's groans and the ragged breathing of the defenders, Marty stood, the heavy pistol still in her hand, trembling from head to foot. The dead outlaw lay a few feet away. Jed was checking on the man Silas had tackled. Silas slowly rose, his face bruised, his breathing harsh. He walked towards Marty, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped before her, gently taking the pistol from her unresisting fingers. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In the depths of his winter sky eyes, she saw a raw mixture of shock, awe, and something else. Something warm and fiercely protective. A connection forged in shared terror and improbable courage. It was a look that spoke more than any words could, a silent acknowledgement that went far beyond her voice, recognizing the steel that lay beneath the song. In the aftermath of violence and fear, something new and fragile, yet incredibly strong, had taken root between them. The night of the outlaws' attack left its mark on Ash Hollow in more ways than one. Besides the fresh grave, they dug for the fallen raider and the patched-up bullet holes in cabin walls. There was a new weariness in the faces of its people, but also a glint of shared resilience. Marty's right arm throbbed from where the heavy pistol had kicked back, bruising her from wrist to shoulder. It was a dull, insistent pain that made even lifting a coffee pot an effort. For several nights, her voice, the town's balm, was silent in the pick and shovel. The saloon reverted to its former state, smoky, filled with low, anxious murmurs, the occasional sharp word, and the clink of glasses that sounded too loud in the absence of her song. The silence was a heavy blanket, reminding them all of what they now missed, what they had almost lost. Then, like a malevolent shadow creeping in after the storm, the sickness returned with a vengeance. The lung fever, which had laid low Jeb's kitchen girl weeks before, now snaked its way through the snowbound cabins. It struck hardest at the very young and the old, those whose flames of life were either too new to burn strong or too worn to resist the chill. The trappers' news of Donovan's gang had cut them off from any hope of fresh supplies, and the town's meager store of medicinal herbs and whiskey did little against the racking coughs and burning fevers. Dr. Abernathy, who served 3 mountain settlements, wasn't due for another month, if the passes even cleared by then. Fear, a more insidious enemy than armed men, began to settle in. Marty, her arm still aching but usable, found herself drawn to the afflicted cabins. She couldn't offer medicine she didn't have, but she could offer presence. A damp cloth for a fevered brow, a spoonful of broth, and she could offer her voice, not in the robust, room-filling way she sang in the saloon, but softly, a gentle crooning that seemed to bypass the ear and go straight to the troubled heart. She'd sit for hours by the cots of fretful children, her low alto a soothing murmur, lulling them into restless sleep. She sang for Old Man Hemlock, whose breathing was shallow and ragged, her voice a quiet thread of courage in the dim, sick-scented rooms, keeping his fragile spirit tethered to the waking world. It wasn't a performance, it was a vigil, her song a shield against the encroaching darkness. Silas Blackwood, in these grim days, was a figure of quiet industry. The outlaws, in their brief, violent tenure, had set fire to the small, communal woodshed at the edge of town, more out of spite than strategy. With methodical determination, Silas began to rebuild it. He salvaged what charred timbers he could, felled new pines, his axe strokes echoing in the crisp, cold air. He worked alone, asking for no help and offering no explanation. Marty would see him sometimes, as she moved between the sickbeds, his solitary figure stark against the snow-laden trees. He'd nod, a brief acknowledgement, his eyes holding that now familiar mix of sorrow and something deeper, something that resonated with her own quiet efforts. One afternoon, after a particularly trying vigil with young Elspeth Carter, who was struggling for every breath, Marty walked past the nearly completed woodshed. Silas was there, planing a long plank of fresh pine. He didn't stop his work, but as she drew level, she noticed something new inside the structure. In one corner, raised slightly off the packed earth floor, was a small, sturdy platform, no bigger than a rug, crafted from the same smooth, pale pine. It was simple, unadorned, yet its purpose was unmistakable. A stage. For her. He hadn't said a word. He wouldn't. But the gesture, so unexpected, so silently considerate, struck Marty with a force that left her breathless. It was an understanding, a validation that went beyond anything spoken. It was a testament, built of wood and quiet labor, to the place she, and her voice, had found in this harsh, isolated corner of the world. A lump formed in her throat, and for a moment, the weariness of the past days, the fear for the sick, the ever-present ache in her arm, seemed to recede, replaced by a wave of profound, almost painful gratitude. But peace, like the winter sun, was a fleeting thing in Ash Hollow. Hollis Craig, who had been conspicuously absent during the worst of the outlaw attack and the subsequent days of tending to the sick, reappeared. His arrogance had returned, sharpened now with a vindictive edge. He found Jedediah Stone in the mostly empty saloon, Marty quietly sipping watered whiskey at a nearby table, trying to ease the chill in her bones. "Stone," Craig began, his voice carrying an unpleasant authority. "I've been reviewing the town ordinances. Old ones? Perhaps, but still on the books." He produced a slim, leather-bound ledger. "It appears this establishment," he waved a dismissive hand, "and indeed the town itself, has certain regulations regarding unregistered labor and persons of no fixed abode or verifiable employment status." His eyes flicked towards Marty, cold and reptilian. Jedediah frowned. "What in blazes are you getting at?" "Craig, I'm getting at her," Craig said, pointing directly at Marty. "This Marty Hughes. She arrived here with no references, no stated skills beyond domestic service. She has no contract of employment with you that I'm aware of. Her nightly exhibitions," he infused the word with contempt, "are hardly a recognized profession. According to Ordinance 7, Section B, individuals deemed to be vagrants or engaged in unratified public displays can be expelled from the township for the general welfare and order." Marty felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. Expelled? Into the snows, with Donovan's scattered men perhaps still lurking. It was a death sentence. Jedediah slammed his hand on the bar. "Now see here, Craig, Marty's more a part of this town than you'll ever be. She's nursed our sick, face-down outlaws. That voice of hers is about the only thing holding us together. Sentiment is hardly a legal argument." "Stone," Craig retorted, a smug smile playing on his lips. "The law is the law, unless she can provide immediate proof of legitimate, long-term employment, or someone is willing to formally sponsor her presence and vouch for her conduct, and take financial responsibility for her upkeep. I will petition the council, such as it is, for her removal." He knew, of course, that the council was a loose gathering of the more prominent claimholders, many of whom were indebted to his mine or feared his influence. The threat hung heavy in the air. Over the next few days, the town, already burdened by sickness and loss, found itself fracturing. Some, like Jedediah and Martha Harris, whose son Marty had comforted even in death, were fiercely loyal. "She stays," Martha declared, her voice thin but unshakable, confronting a group of murmuring miners. "She's earned her place here 10 times over." But others were more hesitant. Fear was a powerful persuader. Craig's mine employed many. His displeasure could mean lost credit, canceled contracts, a harder winter than it already was. Whispers started. "Maybe he's right. She ain't got official papers. Don't want no more trouble. Craig can make things real hard. She's a good singer, sure. But is it worth angering the mine manager?" Marty watched the divisions deepen, a familiar ache settling in her heart. She had sung for them, nursed them, fought beside them. Yet, for some, a dusty, forgotten ordinance and the threat of a powerful man's displeasure weighed heavier in the balance. The little stage in Silas's rebuilt woodshed, a silent promise of belonging, now seemed a fragile hope against a rising tide of uncertainty. And Silas himself, though he said nothing, his eyes, whenever they met hers, held a new intensity, a storm gathering in their wintry depths. The day of the hearing, as Hollis Craig grandly termed it, dawned brittle and cold, though a watery sun hinted at a distant spring. The pick and shovel was packed, not with its usual drinkers, but with the townsfolk of Ash Hollow, their faces a mixture of anxiety, defiance, and grim curiosity. Presiding was old Judge Alistair Craigs, Hollis's father, a man whose stern demeanor was legendary. His face seemed like the granite cliffs surrounding them. Hollis stood beside him, a smirk playing on his lips, the very picture of smug anticipation. Marty sat on a simple wooden bench Jedediah had placed for her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore the gray woolen scarf, a silent testament to an unseen kindness. She felt the eyes of the town upon her, some sympathetic, some wary, some carefully neutral. This, she thought, was how it always was. Her life, her worth, debated by others. Hollis presented his case with lawyerly precision, citing the archaic ordinance, painting Marty as an unmoored vagrant, a potential disruption to the fragile order of their isolated community. He spoke of regulations and the need for propriety, his words cold and impersonal. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Judge Craig cleared his throat. "Miss Hughes," he said, his voice gravelly, "do you have anything to say in your defense, or anyone to speak for you?" Marty opened her mouth, a protest, a plea perhaps, forming on her lips. But before she could utter a word, a figure rose from the back of the room. Silas Blackwood. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas, who rarely spoke more than 2 words together, who had lived in the shadow of his grief for 5 long years, was standing tall, his gaze fixed on the judge. He wore no jacket, despite the chill, his worn flannel shirt emphasizing the lean strength of his frame. He walked slowly, deliberately, to stand beside Marty. He didn't look at her, but she felt the warmth of his presence, a solid shield against the fear that threatened to engulf her. "Judge Craig," Silas began, his voice deeper than Marty remembered, raspy from disuse, but carrying a resonance that commanded attention. "I ain't a man of fancy words. Hollis here, he knows the law books. I know the heart of this town, or what's left of it after this hard winter." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, lingering on Martha Harris, on young Timmy Evans, whose fever Marty had helped break, on Jedediah. "This woman, Marty Hughes," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "came to us when we were buried in snow and bitterness. We judged her by her cover, same as some always do. We offered her dishwater. She offered us hope." Another pause, heavier this time. "When the mine took my Mary and the little ones." His voice cracked then, just for a second, a raw nerve exposed, and Marty's heart ached for him. "This mountain took my voice too, took the light from this town for me. I sat in the dark. Many of us did." Then Marty sang, and for the first time in years, there was something other than the wind howling through the cracks in our souls. He turned slightly, his eyes finally meeting Marty's, and in their depths, she saw an ocean of emotion, respect, gratitude, and something tender that made her breath catch. She didn't just sing for coins, Judge. She sang for Tom Harris when his mother's heart was breaking. She sang our children to sleep when the fever raged. She stood with us, fought with us. When cowards hid, his gaze flicked meaningfully towards Hollis, whose smirk had vanished, replaced by a flush of angry red. "This ordinance Hollis found. It's about keeping out those who'd take from this town. Marty Hughes ain't taken nothin'. She's given us back a piece of ourselves we thought was lost. If that's vagrancy, then maybe we all need a bit more of it. She ain't here out of pity, Judge. She's here because she belongs, because we need her. To expel her would be to cut out the bravest part of our own heart. Just when it's startin' to heal." He fell silent. The only sound in the room was the ragged breathing of the crowd. Then Martha Harris stood, her frail body trembling, but her eyes fierce. "He speaks true," she cried. "My boy." Marty sang for my Tom, young Timmy Evans, clutching his mother's hand, piped up. Miss Marty's songs made the bad dreams go away, one by one. Others rose, their voices joining the chorus. Miners whose spirits she'd lifted, women she'd comforted, even rough-hewn prospectors who'd found a moment's peace in her melodies. It was a tidal wave of support, raw and undeniable. Judge Craig looked at his son, then at the sea of determined faces. at Silas Blackwood standing resolute beside Marty. The judge was a hard man, but not a fool. He saw the tide had turned. He sighed. A long, weary sound. The sentiment of this community is clear, he announced, his voice devoid of its earlier sternness. The petition for expulsion is denied. Miss Hughes may remain. A cheer went up, shaking the rafters of the pick and shovel. Marty felt tears prick her eyes, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and a profound sense of having, for perhaps the first time in her life, truly found a place. Silas's hand found hers, his grip firm, warm, a silent anchor in the emotional storm. In the weeks that followed, as the iron grip of winter began to loosen, a stranger rode into Ash Hollow. He was a dapper man, his city clothes out of place against the rough backdrop of the mining town. He introduced himself as Mr. Alistair Finch, an impresario from Denver, proprietor of the Grand Opera House. Word of a remarkable voice in an isolated mining camp had, through a series of improbable chances, a letter from a traveling geologist who'd passed through, a mention in a Denver newspaper's curiosity column, reached his ears. He'd come to hear Marty sing. He listened, enraptured, as her voice filled the pick and shovel. He offered her an audition, a chance to sing on a real stage, with an orchestra, before a paying audience. Your voice, my dear Miss Hughes, he declared, is a diamond. It deserves a setting of gold. Not this. He gestured vaguely at the rough-hewn saloon. It was the dream she'd never dared to dream. A real stage, recognition, a life beyond hardship. With a heart full of trepidation and a sliver of hope, Marty agreed. She would go to Denver for 1 week. Silas said nothing when she told him, his face unreadable, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or resignation. He simply pressed the gray woolen scarf more firmly around her neck as she boarded the stagecoach that would take her part of the way. Denver was a whirlwind of noise and people and grand buildings. The Grand Opera House was magnificent, all velvet and gilded plaster. Her audition was a success. Mr. Finch was ecstatic. He offered her a contract, a small apartment, gowns, and yet, as she stood on that vast, empty stage, the silence of the cavernous hall felt different from the hushed anticipation of the pick and shovel. The faces she imagined in the darkened seats were anonymous, distant. She thought of the little wooden platform Silas had built in the rebuilt woodshed, rough but real. She thought of Martha Harris's grateful tears, of young Timmy's trusting smile, of Silas's quiet, unwavering presence. His hand in hers, she remembered an old Italian lullaby her mother used to sing, a song of hearth and home, a song she'd hummed to the sick children of Ash Hollow. That melody, more than any operatic aria, resonated in her soul. The stage in Denver was grand, but the audience in Ash Hollow had her heart. After just 5 days, Marty Hughes boarded the stagecoach back towards the mountains. Spring had truly arrived when she returned. The snow was retreating up the slopes, revealing patches of green. The air was alive with the scent of pine and damp earth and the chatter of meltwater. As she walked into town, she saw Silas near the woodshed, not working, but waiting. He held something in his hands, a guitar, simple, well-crafted, its wood gleaming softly in the afternoon sun. He didn't speak, just held it out to her, another silent offering. That evening, as the last rays of the setting sun painted the peaks in hues of rose and gold, Marty Hughes stood on the little wooden stage Silas had built. The townsfolk gathered, their faces upturned, welcoming. She wore the gray scarf, and the new guitar rested comfortably in her arms. Silas sat on his usual wooden chair, now placed near the front, his gaze steady on her. She sang, and her voice, richer and more profound than ever, soared into the twilight. She sang of trials and endurance, of love found in unexpected places, of the beauty of a resilient heart. She sang the old Italian lullaby, and a hush fell over Ash Hollow, a silence filled with shared understanding and a deep, abiding peace. When the last note faded, the applause that rose was not just for the singer, but for the woman, for the friend, for the heart that had found its home. Marty smiled, a genuine, unfettered smile, knowing, finally, that her voice didn't need a grand stage, only open hearts to hear it. And here, in Ash Hollow, under the vast mountain sky, she had found them,